here we go with our questions from the audience. Question number one is directed towards Dr. Frese. The question is, could the doctor please elaborate a little bit more on the studies of the effects of marijuana and the brain? And this is such a Santa Cruz question. It was a second part to it. And during the genetically vulnerable period, is there an amount of marijuana usage that is safe?
Whose question was this now?
I told him about the bumper stickers keep Santa Cruz weird. Now you guys are going to make me be way too right.
As I mentioned, this came to my attention at the ICOSR, which is the International Conference on Schizophrenia Research. Meets every 2 years worldwide, and it was presented by Dr. Murray of the Institute for Psychiatry in Britain. Turns out, from the article that was written, it was actually a research study done by a Dr. Andreasen, who is a captain in the Swedish Army, and he had done a study of his troops and reported the results that showed a very definite relationship between usage of marijuana and likelihood to develop schizophrenia. And this was published in the late 80s, early 90s, and it was totally ignored in the scientific literature until about 2003. And then there began to be another study, and that blockbuster study that is actually the centerpiece of the Dr. Volko's speeches. She's the head of NIDA for the whole country, which is National Institute for Drug Abuse, showing the relationship between taking marijuana, particularly in those teenage years, and individuals with that allele of the COMP gene associated with the valine enzyme. Since that time, there's been tremendous interest in the relationship between marijuana and schizophrenia. In the following ICOSR meeting 2 years later, there was not just one paper, but an entire symposium with presentations by various individuals from throughout the world, all showing the same thing: relationship between taking marijuana and not only coming down with schizophrenia, but for individuals with schizophrenia, the likelihood of their having relapse and the length of that relapse once they had it. And that's very well established, particularly over the last 4 or 5 years. If you want more information on this, all you have to do is Google, put in schizophrenia and marijuana, and there will be a plethora of studies coming up on this. Now, I am upset, and I get upset very easily about lots of things. Initially, I was upset because big media had not covered this, but just in the last week, they've started to. Whether this will become a campaign or not, we're going to find out in the next few weeks, but there have been 2 or 3 news items, both on CNN and on Fox and in the printed press just in the last week or so. The thing that concerns me, however, is my schizophrenia research friends all assure me that they're highly confident that if someone were to do the research, what is the relationship between cocaine usage, methamphetamine, amphetamines, and somebody here asked me at a break on LSD, and likelihood of developing schizophrenia or some kind of psychotic condition. They all suspect there's going to be some kind of relationship. But so far, that research has not been done. And at the last ICOSR meeting, I went up to the primary researcher, he's a fellow named Van Os out of the Netherlands, and said, well, how come research is not being done on these other drugs? And he says to me, well, I'm from the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands, our youngsters go over the border into Germany and get that really strong marijuana over there, and it's a real problem for us, and this is why we've led the study. I said, well, that makes sense, but here in America, well, we've got trouble with marijuana, we've also got it with methamphetamines, etc. So far, that research still has not been done, but I'm sure that's more than you ever wanted to know about asking the question about marijuana and schizophrenia.
Thank you. The next question is for Pete, and actually several people have asked a similar question, so I sort of compiled it into one. It seems there's a theme wherein families who have exhausted their options out in the community are advised to take their chances with the courts and through the criminal justice system, because at least there their family member could be offered the choice of treatment versus jail. They comment that it does seem that the period of probation seemed to help your son, at least initially while he was on it.
I don't think it's ever good to get someone with mental illness involved in the criminal justice system. And there's lots of reasons for that. Mostly what I saw in Miami, where someone would be picked up on a minor offense, taken into jail, where they would either be abused, preyed on, or become psychotic, throw a cup of urine at an officer, and end up caught up in the whole criminal justice system. I realized that in the last few years, many criminal justice systems have gotten really good with mental health courts, which are fabulous. Those of you who don't know about them, if a person is clearly psychotic, you go before a judge who gives a choice of jail or treatment, and you may be psychotic, but you're not stupid, and you end up going into treatment and trying to get into services. I would be very wary of. Here's why I'm so wary of that. I know what people are thinking as the criminal justice system really becomes our de facto mental health system. It's a good way to get somebody in and force them to get into treatment and services, et cetera, et cetera. I get scared. I love CIT. I'm a big proponent of it. I think it's fabulous. My son got tasered just a few weeks ago in Virginia, where I live. Family called mobile crisis, the police showed up, CIT, everything else, the kid ended up getting shot to death. This can be very dangerous. Going into jail is very dangerous. So I would be to me that has to be a last resort. I'd be very wary of it. I understand why people get frustrated, but I would hope that there are non-criminal justice ways to get someone to get the kind of services and help they need. I am a big supporter of peer-to-peer. I don't know if you all have that. I know some people don't think it's that effective because they say, well, you know, how can the... But I have seen it work, and I think it's very powerful. Criminal justice system would be my absolute last choice. And I've struggled with this. I'll be real honest with you. My son got tasered, and 3 years ago at Thanksgiving, he'd gone off his meds. He came completely psychotic, and he got in the car and he disappeared. And he called me after 2 days. He was driving. I said, where are you? What are you doing? He said, I'm going to the promised land. And I pleaded with him to come home. And he said, I'll come, but only if you don't call the police. And so for 4 hours until the battery on my phone ran out, he was driving down, completely psychotic, on 95, driving home from North Carolina, going off the road twice. And don't think I wasn't going through hell. Do I call the State Highway Patrol? What if he hits somebody? What if they stop him? What's going to happen? Unfortunately, he made it home. And I said, okay, we're going to do it your way this time, and it didn't work out. He ended up being hospitalized, but he ended up being hospitalized because he walked around naked and the police picked him up. But I don't know what the right answer is, but I'd be very wary before you get the criminal justice system involved. Courts are not necessarily the best place for somebody who's psychotic. Might not be the answer you want, but what do you all want to jump in there?
All I would say is we create different systems of response for different purposes. That is not the purpose that criminal justice system was set up for. It doesn't mean that people who have a mental illness don't sometimes need to be involved in the criminal justice system, but it's not because of their mental illness, per se. Those are very hard distinctions to make, but I think we need to remember what was the purpose of the setup of that system. What's it designed to do? It's not designed most of the time to do what we're talking about.
I would urge all of you, I hope you all know what CIT is, Crisis Intervention Training, 40 hours of intensive training based on the Memphis model. Sam Cochran. You can look it up on the internet, look it up on my blog, and it is really a community program where you not only train persons in law enforcement who are very aware of this, how to deal with persons with mental illness, but also making the community more responsive. And you need to find out if you have one of those in your community, and you should really support and encourage it. And if you have a mental health court, you're way ahead of Virginia. That's a fabulous thing to get to. But using it as a way to solve a mental health problem, I'd be very leery of that.
I think the other thing I would say, and we do have a very strong interest and are now involved in a planning process for a mental health court, but the other thing I think I would say is, having said what I did, these systems do have to work together. So wherever that interface is, we still want to be there. I may not want to see people in a jail in lieu of other places, or picked up by the police instead of some other way that we can engage them, but it happens. It's reality. And so we have people who work at the interface of those systems, and we'll have to continue to do that. And it's kind of like that kind of cliche about no wrong door. My ideal would be, no, I don't like people entering through the criminal justice system, but if they do, I hope they still get exactly what they need and get where they need.
You reporters never shut up. The last comment, no, I'm talking about me, not you. You're not the reporter. I'm the reporter. The last comment, my son wanted to be a school teacher because he was charged with felonies. You got to remember that too, that if you take somebody in the criminal justice system, assume they're going to go in the treatment, if they fail and they come out with a record, it's going to be a double stigma. It's very hard to get jobs when you have, especially in the Washington, D.C. area, when you have a criminal record.
Leslie, I wonder if you just kind of follow up. Pete had mentioned the issue of peer-to-peer as being a successful component of this. Can you talk a little bit about some of our local peer-to-peer resources?
Oh, yeah, except I have the same response I did when the person asked me what's recovery. I've got people here who are involved in peer-to-peer. Anybody want to raise their hand who's had some experience with peer-to-peer? Okay.
There you go.
Yeah, I was going to say, give us a shout out. What do you think the real strengths and pluses of peer-to-peer are? And I'll help make sure people hear what you say, because I can hear you from up here.
Feel better about yourself.
Help you feel better about yourself.
Provide a safe place to talk about our diagnosis and illnesses and learn too.
Help you have a safe place to talk about your diagnosis and your illness and learn. Anybody else want to add anything about what peer-to-peer has done or can do for folks?
I think Lizzie,
Yeah.
Provide you with a lot of alternative information.
Provide you with a lot of alternative information. Thanks. Yeah. Guy, you were going to say something?
You know, there needs to be a 24-hour United States mental health advocacy union that an advocate could get called, for example, if the person sent to the DHE, society advocate. That person might not like certain medications, so the advocate can be there to line up the advocates.
Okay. And that's a comment, Guy, that we've heard from you about our planning for psychiatric health facility. He's reminding us of the need to make sure advocacy services are available 24/7 to people who may be on a path toward hospitalization or other kind of mandated services of some sort. Thanks.
I thought Lizzie said it really well today. You know, I can't understand what it's like to be on an airplane coming back from Paris and be psychotic. You know, she can.
Yeah, that's peer-to-peer. That's peer-to-peer. And we are very, very appreciative of what that adds to our total response for people. I want to give a little shout out to Carol Williamson. You want to raise your hand in case people don't know you? Carol is president of our local chapter of NAMI. And I know that organization means different things to different people, but what it means to me is the ways that people are helping other people, and peer-to-peer is definitely one of them. Thank you.
This question for Lizzie, and once again, probably about 10 different questions on the same, 10 different people submitted on the same theme. In your own personal success, as well as the individuals with bipolar disorder that you interviewed in their success, what were some of the common themes and specific things that they got from their families in terms of support that contributed to their success?
Okay, good question. So it's actually a couple of questions in my mind. There's the question of what was the common threads between success stories, and then the question of what can families do from my own experience and from people I've interviewed. The common thread, the thing that I write about in Detour, the common thread between the success cases in the book is that all of those people had something outside of themselves that they cared about. And that thing outside, and you very much touched on this in your presentation, that when you have something outside of yourself that you care about, you will take care of yourself in the beginning, in the early stages, when your self-esteem is still sort of rotted. You will take care of yourself because you believe in this other thing. And then, over time, you start to just be in a pattern of taking care of yourself, and that kicks in and becomes kind of a new habit. So what am I talking about? For me, it's writing. I want to finish the stuff that I'm working on, and I want to start new projects as well. For a woman in California, in LA, she was getting her PhD in art history. She now runs a gallery and writes about art. For another woman in my book, it was the fact that she had 2 kids and wanted to be a good mother to them. So it doesn't really matter what that thing outside yourself is, but it's got to be there, and it's got to be something that you're passionate about. I think one thing that I see sometimes that happens with people who are struggling with mental illness is that their whole lives can become about that struggle, or their whole identity can be entwined as being ill. And so if they lose grasp on something that makes life more meaningful, it can be hard to, it can be hard to find that thing if you're sick. The second question about what can families do, in my own, I get, a lot of families in crisis come to hear me speak, and a lot of them read Detour. My basic advice to families is probably stuff you've already heard about. Get as much information as possible, get support, go to NAMI. The NAMI family-to-family program is incredible in terms of getting, getting people who are in crisis access to people who've been through the storm. And then the third piece of advice that I always give that nobody ever likes to hear or take, which I'll tell you, is to get support for yourself, to get counseling. I can't tell you how many times I've had a near hysterical parent going on and on about their kid who's totally out of control and in denial and who won't get help. And I'm trying to tell them gently that they need to get help, that they need to get into counseling themselves. And they'll just say, well, I'm not the problem, my kid's the problem, my kid's the problem. And, after a certain amount of time, you just start to think about how, well, I wonder where your kid learned to be so defiant. Like, you're barely listening to me, you refuse to get help. And that's all to say that one of the things I think my parents did really well is that they modeled self-care for me. My parents both had to go and seek help when I was in crisis because it was unmanageable to them, and because they were freaked out, and they were open about, both of them struggled openly about going to seek help and how it made them feel vulnerable and how they were embarrassed about it, but that sure gave me license to talk about how it felt for me to get help. I've always had 2 people who put their relationship with each other before anything else, and who put their own mental health care as a top priority in their lives. And so I think that's how I learned it. I don't think there's any way to ever teach anyone anything. I don't think there's a better way, in other words, than just modeling it yourself and being open about how vulnerable it actually is to have to go and seek help, to have to admit that you need help. Anyhow, I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. The next question, I guess, is somewhat personal in nature, but I didn't edit it out because I thought it was a good question. And I guess it would go to both Fred and you, Lizzie. Was it difficult to make the decision to have children knowing that would be at higher risk for mental illness? Fred, you want to take that one first?
That's a good question. And I often, particularly early on when I was speaking, an awful lot of young couples would come up to me and ask me that question specifically. If you're going to have children, do you really want to have children when there is a probability that they will come down with this terribly shameful disorder called schizophrenia? To which my response, of course, is, first of all, I absolutely refuse to acknowledge that schizophrenia is a shameful, disgraceful disorder, even though that may be its image. And secondly, that whatever flavor of schizophrenia I have, although I've had some substantive difficulties, I did not see passing on these genes to my now 4 children is to be the catastrophic thing that it is characterized to be in some people's mind. So if the question were, if you have a disease where your children are going to die at age 3 at a 99% probability, I would probably have some serious thoughts about that. If it is to have schizophrenia, and I forgot the mantra that I make in all of my speeches, I didn't put it in this one, but thank goodness with scientific breakthroughs, particularly genomic relationships, this is the best time in history to have a disorder like schizophrenia. I had several of you with schizophrenia come up to me after my talk and speak very openly about having that condition and living with it. And so I think we've got to get out of that mindset of this being something that we should guard against perpetuating in our society, and recognize that this disorder actually comes with, as my sometimes dinner friend Dr. Jon E says, there's some abilities that come with it sometimes as well. So
Yeah,
that would be my response.
Yeah, I like that response. I would add a couple of things. First, I don't have kids yet, but I'm hoping to soon. I think I'd be a pretty great parent for a kid with a mental illness, so I feel ready for that. And the second thing is that my kids may or may not inherit mental illness from me, but they probably will inherit my coping mechanisms. And I'm so much of a believer in the power of coping mechanisms that I have a certain level of confidence that they'll be all right. I feel like I'm all right, they'll be all right. And I look forward to parenthood a lot.
Well, thank you both for being willing to share on that. Question for Leslie. The question is, could you please speak to Laura's Law and the potential of bringing this voluntary commitment law here to Santa Cruz?
Okay. Somebody actually kind of gave me a warning that this might be one of the questions. And first of all, I think it's important. Not everybody probably is familiar with what Laura's Law is, and probably Pete or other people could probably speak to that more knowledgeably than I can. But it involves providing some kind of extension of outpatient commitment possibilities for treatment. And I guess what I would say is that my strongest view on that would be that I would hope that we would be able to achieve some of the same results through engagement, outreach, and a whole range of mechanisms. I absolutely agree with the intentions of the law and completely supportive of what it's about. I also am supportive of us finding as many means to achieve those goals as possible. And so I'm still hopeful that here in Santa Cruz we can find a lot of other ways that we can do that, whether or not we use that law or not. It's a subject, I guess I would say, just to wrap up, that we've not had a community dialogue about. So what my further thought is that I don't think that's a matter so much of my personal opinion as it is of process. What I would want to do in terms of my role is, before anything like that would happen in this community, to have a chance to have an open discussion across the community and hear lots and lots of different points of view about that, because our roles are in a sense to try to be stewards and representatives of community needs and community perspectives. I think I know something about the needs. I don't know enough about all the perspectives that people may have on what we can do about that. So I would be very interested in an open community discussion and dialogue around that. I'd also invite comment from you, Pete, about that, knowing that it's an issue that you have some strong feelings about.
Laura's Law is named after Laura Wilcox. Her parents are fabulous folks. Laura was a college student. She was working at a mental health center and prime of life, doing great, and a person came in, psychosis, started firing and murdered her and shot several people. So her parents, very interesting parents, Fred, you know them too, they, first of all, did not want the prosecutors assumed they'd want the death penalty. They did not want that because they understood that this was a mental illness, but they pushed for Laura's Law, which is a stepsister of Kendra's Law. And Fred, correct me if I'm wrong about this, because you actually are serve on the board still, right, of the Treatment Advocacy Center, which is the group that is behind these laws. Basically, it says if a person has a history of violence, they have a history of going off medication that requires hospitalization, and these are all clearly defined terms. It's not you go off once. Then the state has a right to take that person in court and say you have to go into treatment. It's very controversial, or simply because you're going to be violating someone's civil rights. Their right to, some people put it, your right to be crazy, although I don't like that terminology. It gets to the nub of what I think we need to talk about, which people don't like to talk about, which is, when do you step in? When do you step in and say your behavior is such that you need to get some kind of treatment? And I understand if you have a bumper sticker here that says Santa Cruz, what?
Keep Santa Cruz weird.
Well, then you have a very wide open definition, perhaps, of what is acceptable and is not acceptable. I don't like dangerousness, because I don't think you can predict dangerousness, and that's what the courts have said. I like gravely disabled, but even that's a slippery slope. Let me give you a quick 3 examples, because I think this is a very important subject, and then you can cut me off. I'm working right now with 3 people in Georgetown. One is a white man who lives under a bridge, who is so dirty that his skin is black. Nobody knows where he eats. He has no idea what year. He doesn't know who the president is. He can barely speak. Another person I'm dealing with he's same age as my son, well-groomed, homeless, but he seems, you're talking to him, everything is fine, he's getting along fine, until he starts talking about the masers, which are those tractor beams the CIA sends out.
I hate when that happens.
What?
I hate when that happens.
Third guy has a job, has a family, but once every few months he goes up to Atlantic City, he blows every bit of money they have. His wife has to go haul him out after several days. All 3 of these people have mental illnesses. And under our current law, you can't touch one of them. They have that right. To me, it's rather simple. I'd pull that guy out from under that bridge. I'd get him in, I'd get him cleaned up, I'd give him medication, and then when he finally got medication, if it helped, it has to help, otherwise there's no point, I would talk to him about why he's in that kind of situation. The second guy, I would approach him, I'd say, look, let's get you off the street. You need a place to live. As part of that, let's do housing first. We'll give you a house. All you have to do is meet with the treatment team once a month. They will not require you to take medication, but they'll talk to you about this, okay? Try to help you, try to get you jobs, whatever. The other guy, I don't think there's much you can do at this point. Now, how do you draw that line? Where do you say one's gravely disabled and one's not? I think you have to have protections, but to me, there's no question. And I think Fred has strong feelings about this too. I'm not going to put words in your mouth, so.
Yeah, well, I'd like to remind everyone here that that CD you have on Minds on the Edge, virtually the entire program for an hour, is not just Pete and myself, but 12 other performers commenting on just this issue. And at the end, there's a vote, and about half say, yeah, we're in favor, half are against. Laura's Law is essentially a clone of Kendra's Law. And we have passed this in 19, 20 states now. Usually it is named after somebody who's been killed because of somebody with schizophrenia. It was Kevin's Law in Michigan, Kendra's Law in New York, Laura's Law here. In Ohio, it was going to be Jason's Law. Jason West was a young policeman who was killed with schizophrenia. But in Ohio, even though it was right after the Virginia Tech massacre, the bill went in, and the local NAMI group and the Department of Mental Health both made a mistake, in my opinion. They both wanted the law passed, but they wanted to take advantage of the political will to pass this law to add to their resources. And so they fashioned a bill saying, okay, we'll have a Kendra's type law, but only if we get an additional $20 million a year to provide the services. Now, a little history. When Kendra's law, which by all metrics is tremendously successful, it's lowered hospitalizations by 80-something%, incarcerations by 80-something%, injuries to the patients and to the providers by 50%, tremendous on every metric. But in New York, it came, this was 10 years ago, before the dot-com bubble, much less the real estate bubble. They had lots of money. It came with $120 million a year to provide services for the several thousand individuals that came under Kendra's law. When Laura's law was passed, it was a little later, and Laura's law here in California, you did something different than New York, Michigan, Louisiana, and the other states have done. You made it an enabling law so that each of your 58 counties can decide if they want to implement it. Nevada County, where Laura and her family is from, they became the first to implement it. Los Angeles County, I just learned, I'm not from California, so I don't know the little quirk, but we had our national board meeting last week. Los Angeles County is beginning to implement it. If you decide here in Santa Cruz County that you want to be able to do this, I would be hopeful that you not try to use it, particularly with these financial times, as a device to try to get more funds and only say, well, we'll pass it if we get those funds, because in all likelihood, your politicians are not going to be able to have the funds to do it. Now, the question remains, should you consider a law like that? I addressed this during my main speech when I said I personally don't want to knock on the door, I don't want to be put away, etc. But I recognize that we've gone from 25,000 to 350,000 folks in jails and prisons because we can't put them in the hospital anymore, and that piece put them in the jails and prisons. My guess is most reasonable people don't want to continue with that. However, I ask the question, if we're going, clarification here, because there's something in that video you're hopefully about to watch, where Estelle Richmond, who was head of mental health for the state of Pennsylvania, made the statement and subsequently has been put in a rather high position in the Obama administration, says she does not want this bill because she's against locking anybody up and going back to those old days. The important thing to recognize is this Laura's law does not lock anybody up. What it does, it's an outpatient commitment, as they call it, and what it does is gives treatment to persons in need of treatment who otherwise would be resistant of it. Now, if you think about it, it is very similar to a guardianship, where the decision as to someone gets treatment and what happens to them goes to someone else. It is similar to the mental health courts, where someone goes to the mental health court and is given the choice to either receive treatment or to be incarcerated. All of these are mechanisms, as Professor Moynihan calls it, of leverage. You use the leverage of the system, whether it be legal or some kind of incentivizing through control of payments through payees rather than directly to the individual or whatnot. They all need to take into consideration. Those of us with these conditions have disabilities. Some of us are more disabled than others, and some of us are so disabled we need to get help even though we don't realize it. The question is, as I asked earlier, who determines who needs that treatment? I am totally against our going back to the days when we give that authority totally to the physician, totally to the medical people. I am also against the system as it is now. We get that decision into the hands of not the guys in the white coats, but the guys in the black robes. They make those decisions. Most of them have no training, no real understanding, and yet they wear the jacket as to decide whether that person gets treatment against their will. I would hope, and I've been able to get no political traction on this, but it's my voice in the wilderness, that decision should be made with maximal input from those of us who have actually been in that situation and our family members who have personal experience with persons in that situation, so that we don't leave that decision totally in the hand of professionals, but we have maximal input from those of us who have actually been there.
One of the things, we just went through this big fight in Virginia over this, and one of the problems is that your jurisdictions tend to, for instance, Fairfax County will not commit anyone. You literally had to have a knife at someone's throat and actually start cutting before they will commit. In other counties, it's too easy. It's still, Joe calls up and says Sally's acting a little squirrely, and off they go, you know? I mean, that's ridiculous. The thing about the system I don't like now is that it often puts the family at odds with the person who needs help. You are the person who's calling the police. You are the person who's saying, I want my person locked up, my loved one locked up. You have to go, in Virginia, you have to go, and the case against them has to be made by you. And then if the judge says, well, they're not an imminent danger, they're not a danger, everybody leaves, and you're standing there with your loved one who is not real happy that you just tried to have them committed. And it creates an adverse relationship. And I know some people come from lousy families, I don't deny that, but I also know that a person in Florida told me, said, you know, my sister has been in 8 different mental institutions over her last 30 years. My sister has had dozens of psychiatrists, hundreds of therapists, and many of them said to me, you're the problem, you're a family member, we don't want to talk to you, we don't want anything to do with you. But at the end of the day, 30 years later, who's still with my sister? I am. And that's something that needs to be recognized, and that's why I like what Fred's saying about the family input too. So I know that doesn't make some consumers happy, but I think the family is an essential part.
I just have a comment, not knowing as much as anybody at the table about the issue. Just what strikes me, though, is that I just want to put this out there from a person with mental illness point of view, that I know recovery isn't something you can passively receive. If you can't just force me to get recovery if against my will, and recovery is something that has taken every cell of my body to build at my worst and takes an awful lot of energy to maintain. And my anecdotal experience is that nobody who's not seeking it with every inch of their body gets anywhere with it. So I just question, anytime this comes up, the thing I always think about that I share with you is that how would that ever even work to force people into treatment, into recovery? I just personally, from my experience and from the people who my colleagues and the people who I've spoken to, it has to come from the individual.
I can tell you it worked. First time my son was committed. And 4 days later in the hospital, after he had been knocked on the butt by Haldol, and I'd seen him there drooling, and he was angry. And 2 weeks later, he came to me and he said, "Dad, thank you, because I don't want to be on the street." Did he want to get help? No, because he didn't think anything was wrong with him. He thought the world was fine. He was like what Fred was saying earlier. And, you know, I understand what you're saying, and in a perfect world, I'd absolutely agree. And I think we had good community services. The number of people who would have to be forced would be very, very small. And force should be the absolute last step. But when you have somebody who you love, who is not aware that they are sick, and it's very hard to watch them get arrested, it's very hard to watch them living on the street, and just to walk away and say, well, that's their right, when they don't even know that they're sick. And at that point, I think we need laws where we can step in and say, okay, let's try to do this the best way possible. We want your support, but, you know, I don't think Fred would have wanted to be left on the street. I've heard you say that, correct?
Let me say it myself rather than...
Right. Looking for support, Fred.
Let me remind folks that not only am I a consumer, but I'm a consumer who has been repeatedly involuntarily hospitalized, not given outpatient, hospitalized, and actually been taken to court and declared insane and put away. In spite of those experiences, I am thankful that somebody picked me up in those streets and took care of me. Because, quite frankly, once or twice, had I been allowed to go on being in totally floored psychosis, I would have gotten into a lot of very, very serious difficulty. You often hear quoted that person with psychotic conditions, schizophrenia and bipolar illness, have a 10 to 20% suicide rate. You've heard them. But you should factor into that those suicides are not always suicide. If somebody kills himself and it's by accident, they're not intending to kill themselves, it is not a suicide. If I am on the 16th floor in Bethesda Psychiatric Hospital and I think I am the angel Gabriel and can go out and fly with those bluebirds of happiness, there's a little something that's going to stop me from doing that, and it's called gravity. And when they find my body down below, as they did the very first Secretary of Defense, Mr. Forrestal of this country, they found his body down there when he jumped through that screen, the same floor I was on. Officially, he's a suicide. But having worked as director of psychology at Ohio's largest psychiatric hospital, I can tell you the majority of my patients had delusional systems, and the majority of those systems were religious or mystical of some form. We had a term called messianic. A good percentage of our patients, I thought they meant they were messy at first when I was there, but it's not. They think they're the Messiah or his helper. They can do these divine things. When you're in psychosis, you can go down between those railroad tracks, you can see that train racing right at you 60 miles an hour with that little light, and you know you're on a mission from the Lord, and the Lord will protect you from that train. And when they find that body the next day, that coroner is going to say, this was a suicide. It is not a suicide, because you're never going to know. I'm giving a talk in Louisville 6 months ago. The chaplain afterwards hears my talk and says, you know, Dr. Frese, we had a patient here. The reporters in the Louisville paper reported he drowned in the Ohio River. But I knew that patient. That wasn't suicide. John thought he could walk on water, and he did. I'm giving a talk to the CIT trainers down in Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm being brought back after my talk by the police officer who's in charge of analyzing the wrecks. She said, Dr. Frese, I didn't realize this, but just Father's Day of this year, A man jumped out of the 3rd story onto a car. I was called to analyze the wreck. I got to talk to his mother. He had schizophrenia. He thought he could fly. Over and over again, we have people with a lethal condition. People are going to die. That young lady being raped, gang raped, 3 times a week. It's happening now all over the place. How many times have I seen my own patients say, I don't want treatment, I don't want treatment. We're going to get treatment anyway. We give them treatment, and they say to us, why didn't you do that earlier? Couldn't you tell I was sick? Yeah, we can tell. And that's the way I was. I am floridly psychotic. I'm watching these clowns out there, and they're saying all these things that don't make any sense to me at all. Can't these people see that I'm totally psychotic and they need to take care of me? Just because I'm telling them, bet I'm on another planet. Don't get me started on this. I can go on all night.
I think you can see why I deferred on this topic, but we got time, and to the extent we need to talk about it for Santa Cruz, we all can keep talking about it. Thank you.
And I must add, my son disagrees with me on this point.
Oh, what a surprise.
It's interesting that the topic of medication compliance generates the most intense conversation here, because clearly of the questions it was the most common theme. And I think as these disorders are a spectrum of severities, so is the issues around medication compliance, ranging from sounds like Lizzie's acceptance of the illness and the benefits that medications bring to it, and then others who maybe when they get well maybe think they don't need them and get off the medications.
Nah, I got something to say on that.
No.
May the 3rd, 2007, I'm giving a talk. A lot of these hotels will slip up USA Today under your door. Headlines, front page. People with serious mental illness served in the public sector died 25 years before their life expectancy now, but in the early 90s they were only dying 10 to 15 years before. Antipsychotics and obesity may be factors. And I go to the psychiatric meetings and I talk to my friends, the psychiatrists, because now it's all over the place. What on earth happened here? And I get the same answer. Fred, we were sleeping at the switch. Sleeping at the switch because those specialists, the psychiatrists, focus on whether or not those pills are diminishing the delusions and hallucinations, and these new atypical antipsychotics do that, but they are putting on weight so that that 120-pound gal can be 300 pounds within a year. Those metabolic side effects have to be watched, and I'm very much aware. On my own case, I started taking Thorazine when there was nothing for the side effects. I'm very much aware of the side effects. Some of those pills they pulled off the market for things they found out they could do later. So it's not just compliance, doctor. It is what is, I'm very pleased to see SAMHSA is picked up on and NIMH is picked up on, and that is a thing called shared decision making, where those of us who take these medications actually discuss in a rational manner with the physicians who prescribe these things and take into consideration the fact that we describe what these side effects are doing to us, so including the weight gains, the diabetes, and everything, so that we don't fall back into that situation. We are putting the pedal to the metal in Akron, Ohio, and other places to make sure we have a primary care doc at the next door to our psychiatrist to make sure folks. By the way, when we did that, the very first patient who went from the psychiatrist to the primary care doc had not seen a primary care doc in 27 years. So we need to recognize that people who have these conditions aren't just walking psychotic entities where that psychosis needs to be addressed. We need to watch the entire body. And not just remain compliant with what's ordered for us.
Right. Well, let me shift gears before I get myself in trouble here. What advice, and this would be for the whole panel, whoever wants to take a swing at it, what advice do you all have for the daughter of a mother with bipolar disorder who just simply can't seem to forgive her mom for her shortcomings? Basically, thoughts wanting to be supportive of the mom, but having had witnessed firsthand the effects of the breakdown around those who love her and just not simply able to overcome that.
There's a great Al-Anon story about a woman who was, angry at her alcoholic husband, went to meetings and learned that she wasn't supposed to take care of him anymore. And so she, emboldened by these new principles, went home and let him fall out of bed drunk when he was going to fall out of bed drunk. And she came back to her meetings and she said, "I'm learning detachment. I let him just fall out of the bed, thump, there he goes." And the people at the meeting looked at her like, "That's not exactly loving detachment." And she said, "Well, I don't understand. I was told I was supposed to detach." And they said, no, loving detachment. Think about loving detachment." So she went home that night, and he fell out of the bed drunk again. And she got up, and she took a blanket, and she put it over him. And she got back into bed and went to sleep. And that metaphor, put the loving blanket on someone, is my advice that I give to people who are struggling with someone who's out of control in their lives. That you can find a way to love them and to care about them without imperiling your own serenity, without imperiling your own mental health.
I would just add that for the person in that experience, I'm reminded of something you said earlier, Lizzie. One of those other stories for me from New Orleans was a woman who came to me about her mother. And her mother was seriously mentally ill and walked naked in parks and got in all kinds of trouble and so on and so forth. And she was in agonies about what to do, and she wanted to know, this is my mom, I should care, and I'm so mad at her, and so on and so forth. Similar story. And I said, I think we start with taking care of you. Okay? And we got her connected with a group at National Alliance. Thankfully, we had a great local chapter. And when she was able to get support and compassion and feel embraced herself for her own suffering in that situation, she felt far better able to extend that blanket. It happened naturally. Nobody had to help her figure out more about that, but she had to start by forgiving herself for having those difficult feelings and accepting them and letting some people help her. That woman now runs an organization across the state of Louisiana called The Extra Mile that extends volunteer and community supports to people with mental illness across the entire state. She started by embracing herself and accepting her own pain and needs and letting people help her. Now she's not only been able to do that for her mother, she's doing it for people across an entire state.
I think that there's a very important thing here we should not forget, and that is that our attitude today in 2010 toward mental illness is not what the attitude of our parents and their parents were, and therefore degree of understanding between us and them is going to be complex. Let me give you an anecdote from my own family. When I first started giving these talks, my parents visited from Florida, and I happened to be on the local television show, and I came home, and they'd never spoken of my illness at all. My father greeted me at the door and said, "Son, we're proud of you." They go back to Florida. A week later, I get a call from my mother. She says, "Son, your father and I have been talking about this situation you do with the TV shows and speaking about schizophrenia, and I just want you to know that, like your father says, we are proud of you, but could I ask you just one thing?" And I said, "Sure, Mom, what is it?" She says, "Would you please tell your audiences it's not from my side of the family?" And I said, Of course, Mom.
She's your mom. You better say that.
About 10 years ago, my mother passed away. And I'd always been curious as to why my father in the service would travel around a lot, but I'd started the first grade in February. I'd missed 6, 7 months of school, and I always wondered why. And after my mother passed away, her sibling told me that they could now tell me something that they had promised my mother they would never tell anyone in the family, and that was my mother had been put in the state hospital when I was 6 years old, so that her absolute inability to even talk about insanity in the family is bundled up in experiences that she and undoubtedly her own relatives have had, that in those generations you did everything you could to make sure nobody knew the family secrets. Now, fortunately, we're beginning to change these things, but I think when we think about our relationships with our parents, we should be understanding of the fact that they come from very, very different perspectives than ours.
You know, I've had some parents tell me, and it's in my book, that you had to be prepared to have your daughter or son who has a mental illness hate you in order to help them. I've had other parents tell me that they had to think about their child actually dying before they could move on and take the next step and see this person different. That is why, and I was glad to hear Lizzie mention it earlier, I think the NAMI family-to-family course is really, really important, because it is both the parent has to change their views, you have to change your expectations, you have to redefine what you think success is, and it makes you look at that. Of all my 7 children, I am the proudest of my son with mental illness, simply because of all the obstacles he's had to overcome to be successful. And it's amazing to me, just amazing to me. In my own family, my parents, 89, 90, still living, had a real hard time with this. And they didn't, my father did not want me to tell his 2 sisters who were in their 80s about the book. And I said, well, that's going to be kind of hard to hide, write about this. And then he said, well, I'm very, very proud of you. And he said, but you know, it came from your ex-wife's side. And I was happy to agree with that. But I did some checking, and I said to my dad, do you remember Uncle Harry? Yeah. You know, he was an alcoholic, and everybody called him Weird Harry. And he goes, yeah, but he was a drunk. We got a lot of alcoholism in the family. And I said, ever heard of co-occurring? He goes, no, we're Irish. Of course you have a lot of drunks in the family. And I said, no. And I thought my dad and mom had finally gotten it, and then when my son got peer-to-peer, they said to me, well, I don't really think that's a good idea, because I don't know if he should be associating with those people all the time. And, you know, they're 89 and 90, and it's a different world, and you explain it to them, but this is tough for families to accept.
Question came about either laws on the books or pending legislation that would help protect persons with mental illness in the workplace. Is there any coverage under the Americans with Disabilities Act on that topic?
In 1990, when the ADA passed, and the only reason we were included, those with serious mental illness, is because Justin Dart, who was the president's head of disability rights, he was in a wheelchair, happened to also be bipolar. And he, with some encouragement from our advocacy groups, included persons with serious mental illness. It took 7 years for the federal government to actually write guidelines as to what the reasonable accommodations for persons with serious mental illness might be. And in the courts, the rulings generally have not gone for persons with mental illnesses as disability. So the ADA, whereas it's given us handicapped parking places and drive up curbs and reconstructing doorways for physically handicapped, it has not done that much yet for the seriously mentally ill. And let me remind you of something most people don't know. In federal circles, the ADA for jobs is trumped by affirmative action laws. And that while affirmative action rightfully includes people from ethnic minorities and women, it does not include the disabled, and certainly not the disabled mentally ill. And so when those federal rights come forth, often the affirmative action finds itself putting disabled people out of work to enforce the affirmative action rules. That's the downside for us. On the bright side, there's the federal definition of serious disability. There are about 62 definitions, but a key one, which is incorporated in most of them, say essentially, in order to be identified as a seriously disabled person, one must be permanently and chronically disabled. Our problem has been, particularly for our folks with bipolar illness, but also schizoaffective and schizophrenic folks who are subject to relapse, our conditions are episodic or periodic. And we have just gotten written into the forthcoming definition now in the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, which is one of 17 standing committees of the U.S. Senate. The wording episodic and or periodic built into that definition. So coming forward, it should be easier for persons with our conditions to be included in those laws that cover persons with serious disabilities. So, but we'll see how it does.
Thank you. The next is a two-part for Lizzie. Question of...
I'm sorry, one other important thing that I forgot. The Social Security, this is very important. Social Security Administration 5 years ago created a category called compassionate allowance. It was originally created for individuals with Lou Gehrig's disease, fairly rare. But if you have this disease, you immediately cut through the bureaucratic red tape and move right on to disability, and you're protected on that. About 50 rare diseases, mostly cancers, are on that now. But in October, the Social Security Administration had hearings in San Francisco, nationally, for inclusion of schizophrenia in that compassionate allowance. The Social Security Administrator indicated that come August, give or take a month or two, we can be very hopeful that schizophrenia will be designated as a disorder that will be considered for compassionate allowance under the new Social Security regulation. So it'll be a while after it takes effect that the word gets down to everybody, so you'll look for that because it becomes very important with regard to getting our folks disability. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. So the question for Lizzie is, could you comment on possible red flags for bipolar disorder in somebody in their early teen years, I guess, other than thinking they're a cat? And looking back on it, do you think you would have benefited from medications earlier on in your illness?
I would almost rather someone else take the question of red flags, because I'm not a psychiatrist, and I could tell you what you could read on the internet, which is that bipolar disorder is characterized by episodes of mania and depression, and that when people are having episodes that go beyond normal teenage ups and downs and are actually interfering with their ability to have the lives that they want to have, that's when there needs to be, that's when it's a problem that might require treatment. But after I finish the next question, maybe if somebody else wants to talk about red flags. I think obviously there's dangers to diagnosing people too early, particularly if it's the wrong diagnosis. And I think in my case, it was important for me to believe the diagnosis that I had received, and by the time I got it, because things had been so bad, I did believe it. So if you had given me a diagnosis earlier based on less substantial evidence, I would have really challenged it and had a hard time being compliant and responsible in my own recovery. So in some ways, though obviously it was a traumatic experience, it definitely was the kind of experience that made me believe that I had a serious mental illness, which also then, in turn, made me responsible for my own recovery afterwards. That's how I feel about it.
I'd like to address this from a policy perspective over the last 20 years. As was mentioned, I was on the National NAMI board for 12 of the last 14 years, and prior to that I was on the National Curriculum and Training Committee for Professions, so I got about a 20-year view. What happened was, one of the motivations early on with NAMI was the fact that there was a mindset with the government that poverty caused schizophrenia and serious mental illness. Therefore, lots of efforts were made to raise funds for prevention of serious mental illness, and the money would go to poverty programs. NAMI drew a line in the sand and said, that's going to end. We aren't going to pay attention to prevention at all. It's only going to go to our relatives coming out of those state hospitals with the serious mental illness. That went on until about 10 years ago when we had a critical board meeting in Washington with the head of NIMH. Steve Hyman convinced us there was enough research for us to be able to identify individuals who were vulnerable for schizophrenia and other forms of psychosis in their early teenage years. And so NAMI officially agreed to support prevention efforts, research and others, with these words: we'll support prevention only to the extent that it focuses on early identification and targeted intervention, not to the broad, let's cure mental illness for the entire society. Now, this comes forward to this year when the federal government under the Obama administration announces $60 million research effort called RAISE, R-A-I-S-E, research.
Good luck. Keep going.
Or initial schizophrenic episode, research assessing initial schizophrenic episode. This was supposed to be $40 million. When we went in, the week before we go in, the Obama administration says, we got stimulus money here, let's make it $60 million. And so there are 100 schizophrenic researchers based at Columbia and Long Island Jewish who have charge of this research, which focuses on, for the very first time, first episode of schizophrenia and precursors in identifying prodromal symptoms. In other words, the red flags that are being mentioned here. So that research is commencing just in the last few months, and over the next 5 years we can expect to be making real progress. In the meantime, Australia and parts of Canada are way ahead of us, so we do have some information on this, but we expect to have much more in the next few years.
I get very frustrated with a lot of these psychiatric labels. First of all, this is a multi-layered problem. My wife's a teacher. They identify somebody who's acting very oddly in school, maybe a lot of things. So what happens is they counsel with the parents, and the parents take them to a general practitioner who is not trained to diagnose very sophisticated psychiatric problems, and he immediately prescribes Ritalin, and then you have everybody run around saying, well, everybody's trying to put everybody on Ritalin, and blah, 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 blah. I get frustrated with these labels. My son's been diagnosed as bipolar disorder, schizoaffective, early onset schizophrenia, and the truth is they don't know what's wrong. They have no clue. They're giving him lithium. Well, it doesn't work. Well, he must not have bipolar. Well, this works. Well, maybe he has that. The brain's very complicated, and we have arguments about whether there is even anything such as a mental illness. So it's very difficult to, I mean, if we had a blood test that said, oh, you got schizophrenia, oh, you got bipolar disorder, we'd all be a lot better off. But these labels, to me, are not as important, and I know it's heresy in the mental health community, as trying to figure out how to help my son. And that's how I think most parents are. I don't care if he's bipolar. I don't care if he's schizophrenic. I want to know what I can do to help him with the least damage to his future health.
I was going to, all I can add is that's not heresy to me, Pete. That speaks to me, too.
I'd like to add something else, however. The DSM, Diagnostics and Statistical Manual, is the virtual Bible that psychiatrists use. Right now we're in iteration 4. They've announced recently that iteration DSM-5 will come out in March of 2013. Now, they've already got proposals. In fact, you can go to the website under DSM now, and you can look over what those proposals are and make recommendations. Part of those recommendations have been one that's not very popular, probably won't happen, but it's out there, and that is to identify a disorder as susceptible for psychotic condition. So they would actually be able to bill for giving treatment to individuals who have red flags that might look like they develop. That's very controversial.
Yeah.
Even more controversial in my mind is the proposal to wipe out the category of schizoaffective disorder. And when I was asked to comment on this at the national meeting of ICS-OSR on whether or not they should go forward with this, I told them very clearly that I have been a person with schizophrenia for the last 40 years. And I have been told all this time that if I took my medicine and I was good, I might someday be promoted to be a schizoaffective. And now they're going to wipe out any chance I have. Like you, they laugh, but I don't know what they're going to do with it.
All right. Well,
They give you a card.
with that, I would like to thank our panel very much once again.